Establishing a central pawn presence immediately stakes a claim for board control and opens diagonal avenues for future piece development. Challenging the center's initial dominance, d5 immediately contests white's pawn and opens a path for the queen and bishop. Aggressively contesting the center, white immediately seeks to unbalance the pawn structure and create attacking chances. Solidifying the central pawn structure, this choice invites a positional battle, prioritizing piece development over immediate pawn contention. Developing the knight to its natural square reinforces the central pawn structure and prepares for further expansion. Solidifying the center and preparing for a flexible pawn structure, this move subtly prepares to challenge white's central dominance. Solidifying the center and preparing nf3, it neatly avoids early tactical skirmishes and embraces a positional battle. Developing knights towards the center solidifies black's pawn structure and prepares for queenside castling. Developing the bishop to this active square prepares castling and eyes the kingside. This development elegantly reinforces black's pawn structure and prepares to contest the center, a cornerstone of queen's gambit declined play. Preparing to fianchetto the light-squared bishop on b2 grants control over the long diagonal and supports a potential queenside expansion. Challenging the central pawn chain so directly opens up immediate possibilities for piece activity, but it also risks creating structural weaknesses if black isn't careful with subsequent play. Accepting the pawn sacrifice opens lines for your bishops. Now focus on developing pieces harmoniously, perhaps bringing your queen into the fray to exploit the temporarily weakened kingside. The knight bravely intercepts the pawn, challenging central control and opening lines for its queen and bishop. This active recapture signals black's intention to fight for initiative rather than passively defend. It steers the game towards a more dynamic, less symmetrical structure. Opening up the d-file for potential queenside pressure, this exchange simplifies the central tension and sets the stage for piece maneuvering. Black must carefully consider recapturing to avoid creating isolated pawns while white aims to activate their knight. Black recaptures, immediately centralizing the knight and contesting the e4 square while opening a path for the queen's rook. Capturing en passant, the pawn chain on white's queenside now becomes a target as a consequence of opening that central file. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight establishes a dynamic central presence, immediately challenging white's pawn structure and opening lines for active piece play. Positioning the bishop to the long diagonal now aims to exploit the e5 pawn's potential vulnerability while reinforcing the d4 square. Observe how this creates a future tension that could lead to piece activity or pawn structure shifts. Seeking to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate the queen, this checking maneuver forces white to consider immediate defensive arrangements, potentially sacrificing tempo for material if not handled precisely. Relinquishing the kingside castling option is a bold decision, potentially leaving your monarch exposed to future queenside pressure or central attacks if black manages to open the position. Liberating the dark-squared bishop from its cramped position on f8 by forcing the queen to retreat creates immediate attacking potential, although it also initiates a sequence that might temporarily weaken white's central pawn structure. Recapturing on d3 resolves the immediate threat to white's queen and reestablishes a central presence, though it surrenders the pawn on e5 and invites black to solidify their pawn chain. Establishing a robust pawn chain on the queenside while simultaneously preparing to connect the rooks seems to be the intention, but it neglects the immediate central tension and the potential weaknesses on the queenside itself. Shifting the knight to e2 avoids the immediate fork on c3 and prepares to redeploy it, perhaps to g3 or f4, aiming to shore up the kingside and participate in the central struggle, while also unblocking the bishop on f1 for potential future development. Unleashing a targeted bishop strike, black immediately challenges the queen's square and begins to wrestle for diagonal dominance, aiming to disrupt white's nascent pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances along the queenside. Securing the central squares while simultaneously aiming the queen towards black's potentially exposed monarch is the tactical idea here. Bolstering the central pawn structure and aiming to shore up the king's immediate surroundings, f6 seeks to create a more robust defensive setup against white's looming queen and bishop battery. This prophylactic move, however, does introduce a potential weakness on the dark squares should white manage to exploit the half-open g-file later. Asserting control over the crucial central open file, this maneuver immediately challenges black's queen and positions the rook for potential pressure along the c-file, aiming to exploit any weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The bishop's advance to c5 aims to exploit the slight disarray on white's kingside, directly challenging the queen and creating immediate tactical possibilities. The repositioning of the queen to c3 effectively challenges the diagonal occupied by black's bishop and simultaneously prepares to contest the c-file should it open, aiming to exploit any lingering weaknesses around black's king. Black's queen bravely ventures forward, creating immediate pressure on the queen side and challenging white's central control. The intention is to disrupt white's harmony and potentially exploit the open c-file, all while seeking active counterplay against the isolated d4 pawn. Shifting the queen to d2 initiates a subtle repositioning, aiming to bolster the king's safety and prepare for potential piece activity. The king's early excursion to f1 left it exposed, and QD2 offers a degree of protection by creating a defensive corridor. Furthermore, it clears the path for the rook on c1 to potentially join the action on the central files or prepare for a queenside initiative. While not immediately aggressive, this move prioritizes solidifying white's position and building a foundation for future operations, accepting a temporary lull in direct confrontation to ensure structural integrity. The bishop on b4 suddenly injects a dose of activity, challenging white's rather static queen on d2 and potentially disrupting its coordination with the rook on c1. This repositioning forces white to consider immediate threats rather than continuing with their subtle queenside expansion. It's a proactive stance, seeking to exploit any slight awkwardness in white's formation before white can solidify their central presence further. Rerouting the queen to the d1 square now aims to untangle white's pieces, especially the knight on e2, which has been awkwardly placed, and prepares to support a potential advance on the king side or central expansion. King safety, a paramount concern, is finally addressed through castling, a prudent decision given the exposed nature of the queen side. Attempting to seize initiative by immediately contesting the queen side, this move pries open the file and simultaneously probes for weaknesses in black's pawn structure, potentially forcing concessions or creating outposts for white's pieces if black is not vigilant. Reorganizing the queen to a more active square, potentially preparing for pawn advances or consolidating the queen side. Relocating the king to a more secure square aims to clear the first rank for potential rook activity and provides a safer haven from the pressure black's pieces are exerting. The rook's journey to the semi-open c-file signifies a crucial shift in black's strategy, aiming to seize control of this vital corridor and challenge white's central pawn structure, while simultaneously preparing for potential exchanges that could simplify the position and activate black's pieces. Unlocking the c-file's potential, knight relocation to d4 initiates a fascinating positional struggle by aiming to dislodge the entrenched black pieces and seize central control. Swapping off the defender of the d-pawn immediately simplifies the position and prepares for active piece play. The rook's departure from the c-file, while seemingly natural, now opens up critical avenues for white's knights to potentially infiltrate, especially if black doesn't quickly solidify their pawn structure. Observe how the doubled pawns on the queen side, a lingering structural weakness, might become more exploitable as black's defensive resources diminish. Consider the tactical implications of white's bishop pair and how it could dominate the now more open diagonals. Recapturing on c1 immediately retrieves material, but it surrenders the crucial c-file, potentially gifting black valuable attacking opportunities. White's king looks exposed, a testament to the king's safety trade-off made earlier. This recapture initiates a positional battle where control of open files and central pawn structure will be paramount. The queen's proximity creates immediate tactical possibilities. Watch for any forks or discovered attacks. Reclaiming the open file with the rook signals a shift towards active defense and potential counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's centralized queen and potentially exploit the weakened light squares around the white king. Reclaiming the open file is paramount, and relocating the queen to a more secure and active square makes perfect sense as white seeks to coordinate pieces and prevent black from consolidating their recent gains on the queen side. Finally, a decision is made to centralize the queen and prepare for potential skirmishes on the queen side, acknowledging the awkwardness of its previous placement. Initiating an assault on the king side, white aims to exploit any lingering weaknesses around black's monarch. This pawn push is a long-term strategic maneuver, seeking to open lines and potentially create attacking chances, even if the immediate impact is subtle. It prepares for potential pawn advances like g4 and f4, gradually building pressure. Black's queen boldly steps into a more active central post, eyeing white's king side and aiming to disrupt white's coordination while potentially creating tactical skirmishes. Swapping queens here signals an immediate pivot towards the endgame, aiming to simplify the board and leverage the king's newfound centrality. White embraces the imminent simplification, recognizing that the current pawn structure offers no clear attacking avenues and preferring a cleaner, more manageable fight in the latter stages of the game. The absorption of the pawn opens a path for black's remaining pieces, particularly the rook on c8, to become more active and potentially pressure white's somewhat exposed king. Black will now aim to coordinate their forces, perhaps by bringing the queen into play on the central files, while also considering the long-term structural implications of this capture on white's pawn chain. Pushing the h-pawn now creates a potential weakness on the g6 square, but simultaneously offers the king a new escape route should the center ever collapse. A calculated retreat of the king, clearing the 6th rank for potential pawn advances and seeking refuge from white's probing rook on the now open c-file, though it does leave the monarch somewhat exposed on the diagonal. The rook's repositioning to the 4th rank initiates a strategic redeployment, aiming to exploit the potentially open files and pressure the opponent's less defended areas, while simultaneously preparing to support any king-side pawn advances that might emerge. The bishop's diagonal advance here is a fascinating attempt to activate a dormant piece and pressure white's queenside structure, creating a subtle yet significant shift in the positional dynamic. Rescuing the rook from its precarious outpost opens up the h-file for potential pawn advancements, aiming to create a passed pawn or exploit the exposed black monarch. Gaining central influence and preparing to contest the c-file becomes the immediate priority, aiming to dislodge the opponent's pieces from their advantageous positions. The rook's retreat to h4 signals a shift in focus, acknowledging the dangerous advanced pawns and the potential for a king's side invasion. By repositioning the rook, white aims to solidify the defense and prevent immediate tactical incursions, while simultaneously eyeing the possibility of a later kingside pawn push. This maneuver prepares for a more patient game, focusing on positional improvements rather than immediate confrontation. Securing the bishop's potential escape route to b5 while simultaneously reinforcing the queenside pawn structure. This maneuver prepares for future maneuvering, perhaps eyeing the c4 square or creating options to redeploy the queen. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure with g3 aims to create a refuge for the monarch, preventing any immediate infiltration by black's rook or bishop along the h-file or the 3rd rank. This proactive defense anticipates potential tactical threats and offers a bit more breathing room for white's pieces. Black aims to activate the rooks and create attacking chances, but must be careful not to overextend and allow white's pieces to infiltrate the weakened queenside. Refortifying the monarch's position, 31. KG2 prioritizes king's safety by moving it away from the open file and potential threats from black's bishop and rook coordination, a prudent decision to prevent any immediate tactical skirmishes that could arise from its current, more exposed, placement on the king side. Repositioning the bishop to the active c5 square aims to exchange it for white's potentially troublesome knight on d4, simplifying the position and perhaps activating black's other pieces more effectively. The rook's relocation to the 1st rank, while seemingly passive, is a subtle repositioning in preparation for a potential endgame squeeze, anticipating a likely pawn structure shift. Sacrificing the bishop opens up the path for black's rook on the 7th rank, creating a potentially powerful passed pawn situation if white's king can't manage the pressure on the now exposed f2 square. Finally, white addresses the persistent knight pair with a clear positional concession. The bishop now activates, aiming to exploit the weakened pawn structure on the king side, a consequence of black's active but somewhat scattered piece play. This move aims to trade off black's most active defender on d4, seeking to simplify into an endgame where white's remaining pawns might find more scope, though the dark-squared bishop's influence over the central squares is diminished. Stepping onto that square offers the bishop a more active post, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially eye the g2 king, but it risks getting hemmed in by white's advancing kingside pawns, potentially isolating it and making it a target. The king finds itself in a precarious predicament, pushed into the open with a clear lack of defenders and open lines pointing directly at it. The immediate focus should have been on either reinforcing its safety or launching a counteroffensive to disrupt the opponent's coordination. The black bishop, having navigated a winding path through the queenside and central skirmishes, now lands on a surprisingly aggressive outpost, directly threatening the white king and creating immediate tactical complications. This aggressive placement might be an attempt to disrupt white's rook activity or exploit potential weaknesses around the monarch. The resulting checks will force white to react, potentially leading to material exchanges or a shift in the strategic balance. Displacing the black bishop from its excellent outpost on d3 forces a difficult decision for white regarding king's safety, as the opposing monarch now has a clear path to shelter within the pawn shield. Opening a new avenue for the b-pawn creates dynamic play and tests white's resolve to hold the position together under pressure, potentially leading to a pawn breakthrough or forcing a concession. Attempting to anchor the rook on the king side, white offers a passive pawn push that doesn't address the immediate threats or create dynamic opportunities. Seizing the open file, black's pawn advance offers a tactical gambit, potentially unraveling white's pawn structure and opening lines for attack, though it requires careful calculation to avoid falling into a trap. Gaining crucial space on the queenside, this pawn thrust finally resolves the queenside tension, opening lines that white hopes to exploit. Repositioning the rook to the 5th rank opens up the possibility of an immediate invasion on the queenside, threatening to unravel white's pawn structure and expose weaknesses around the king. This repositioning of the king, clearing the path for the rook, signals an intention to activate that dormant piece. White seeks to exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's rook on the open file, perhaps aiming for a maneuver that forces concessions. The king's journey from the center, while appearing passive, is crucial for supporting an eventual rook swing to the open file, aiming to disrupt black's defensive structure and create counterplay on the queenside or center. Seizing the rook on the queenside opens lines for black's remaining forces and forces white into awkward defensive maneuvers. The monarch abandons safety, venturing into the heart of the pawn structure, a bold gambit that might awaken tactical possibilities or simply leave him exposed to further harassment. Solidifying the pawn structure, this move strategically prevents white from exploiting potential weaknesses on the king side and prepares to coordinate the rook and bishop for future counterplay. The rook's retreat to the 3rd rank seems to be consolidating its position, seeking to defend the pawn and potentially support a future g-pawn push, aiming to gain more space on the queen side or create new attacking avenues. Unleashing the rook to the open 4th rank offers a tantalizing prospect of harassing white's king and activating piece play, though it potentially isolates the passed pawn on a6. Unleashing the rook along the 3rd rank aims to disrupt the black queen's comfortable outpost, and simultaneously offers a potential pawn sacrifice to open lines for white's remaining pieces. The rook's relocation to the open file offers renewed pressure, but the king's safety remains a pressing concern, potentially creating future targets. Seizing the open file with the bishop offers a crucial tactical opportunity, potentially disrupting black's pawn structure and forcing concessions. Harnessing the recent exchange, black redirects the king's attention toward the queenside action, subtly aiming to bolster its presence near the vulnerable pawn structure on the b-file while simultaneously preparing to contest the open c-file if the opportunity arises. Asserting control over the vulnerable queenside pawns is the immediate objective here, aiming to restrict black's maneuvering options and prevent any dangerous expansion. Activating the rook behind the pawn chain aims to exploit the open files and potential weaknesses created by white's king's awkward position on the flank. Spotting the loose bishop and aiming to trap it creates a beautiful diagonal assault. Unleashing a bishop from its passive post to eye the opponent's queen and king presents a dynamic shift, aiming to disrupt white's established pawn structure and potentially create mating threats down the f-file. Unleashing the rook along the newly opened file aims to disrupt black's coordinated pieces, particularly threatening the vulnerable bishop on h1. The rook sacrifices itself, opening a diagonal that will soon allow the queen to deliver a fatal blow to the enemy monarch, forcing a concession of material or checkmate. The king ventures out, but this doesn't immediately seem like a tactical opportunity given the immediate checks black can generate, instead seeking a safer square behind the pawn chain. The black rook, now unleashed and active on the 7th rank, targets the exposed white king with a forcing check, attempting to exploit the king's compromised shelter. Seeking refuge on the flank, the white king desperately attempts to escape the mating net woven by the black rooks and bishop. The rook's desperate dash to g1, aiming to penetrate white's position and perhaps create a mating net with the bishop on f3, highlights black's dwindling attacking resources. However, this aggressive sortie leaves the king vulnerable on the open diagonal, and white's bishop on a5 now eyes the crucial f2 square, potentially creating a decisive pin or even a discovered attack if black isn't careful. A moment of reckoning for white's king, exposed to a swift regrouping of black's forces, as the rook on g3 now finds itself the target of an immediate counterattack. Seizing the open b-file offers a glimmer of activity, aiming to disrupt white's reorganized pieces and perhaps create some counterplay before white's king becomes too entrenched. Opening up the bishop's diagonal to potentially harass the black king is a bold gambit, but it might expose white's own king to further threats if black finds a tactical riposte. The black king bravely emerges from its shelter, seeking activity in the endgame, though this adventure leaves its pawns vulnerable and its path potentially fraught with tactical traps from the vigilant white rook. This bishop repositions itself to control the critical long diagonal, aiming to support the pawn push and potentially create threats against black's king once the rook is no longer pinning the g-pawn. Suddenly, the pawn's storm on the kingside opens a perilous pathway for black's rook to infiltrate the defensive ranks. Unleashing the rook to the h-file signals an attempt to finally apply pressure along that weakened side of black's pawn structure. This quiet repositioning of the bishop to f3 aims to consolidate the black position and prepare for potential future pawn advances, or to simply add defensive support to the king's vicinity, creating a more robust defensive structure, as white's rook on h3 appears poised to become more active. The rook now solidifies its hold on the 2nd rank, creating a formidable defensive barrier and preparing to support a potential advance of the kingside pawns, aiming to disrupt black's coordination. The black rook, after a journey from g1, now positions itself on the kingside, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and exploit the open files created by the recent pawn exchanges. This aggressive maneuver seeks to create immediate threats and complicate the endgame, preventing white from consolidating their material advantage too comfortably. Initiating an advance with the bishop to c2 presents a bold attempt to disrupt black's consolidated pawn structure and create open lines for white's rook. The pawn on a4 now becomes a serious obstacle, potentially creating a passed pawn if white isn't careful, and it also severely restricts the mobility of white's rook. Clearing the back rank allows the rook to dominate the open file, posing an immediate threat to the black king's exposed position. Recapturing the pawn on c1 solidifies black's pawn structure and maintains the pressure on white's pieces, preventing any immediate counterplay and aiming to exploit the weakened kingside. Sacrificing that bishop opens up a clear path to capture the pawn on a4, which would greatly simplify the position and simplify the endgame for white. The king's exposed position on the kingside, once a fortress, now resembles a target practice dummy. This check, while momentarily disrupting the enemy ranks, only serves to highlight the defensive shortcomings that will inevitably lead to disaster. A desperate attempt to block the looming rook and potentially create some counterplay on the kingside, but the fundamental structural weakness remains exposed. Exposing your king further, this bishop maneuver seems to relinquish control of the crucial central squares and invites a swift counterattack on your weakened monarch. The king is conspicuously exposed here, a beacon for the enemy's remaining pieces. Finally, the bishop finds a square where it can exert some pressure, hinting at a potential disruption of white's well-entrenched pawn structure on the queenside, though the immediate impact is limited by the concentration of pieces in the center. Opening a clear path for the rook to the 7th rank aims to disrupt black's solid pawn structure. The infiltration onto the file demands immediate attention. Leaving it unchecked allows for dangerous pressure against white's queenside pawns. Bringing the king back to g2 intends to provide a safe haven, likely anticipating further exchanges and a potential descent into a simplified endgame where pawn structure and king activity become paramount. Securing the rook on the d-file is a prudent consolidation after the previous pawn push. It now stands ready to support the advancing pawn, creating a new threat.